Think about the last time someone gave you a list of things to remember, a grocery list, a set of instructions. Maybe your manager rattled off 5 tasks before a meeting, or a friend told you a long, winding story at dinner. Here's what I want you to ask yourself right now. What do you remember from that list, from that story, from that conversation? If you're like most people, like most human beings, you remember the first thing, you remember the last thing, and everything in the middle, gone, fuzzy. Maybe you can catch the edge of it if you really strain, but mostly it just isn't there. And here's the thing that blew my mind when I first learned this. That's not a flaw. That's not you being distracted or careless or bad at paying attention. That is your brain running an ancient, deeply wired program, one that has shaped how you learn, how you love, how you fight, how you remember entire years of your life. Today, we're going to talk about that program. It's called the serial position effect. And once you understand it, you will never think about memory or experience the same way again. Segment 1. What the serial position effect actually is back. In 1885, a German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus did something kind of obsessive. He spent years memorizing and rememorizing long lists of nonsense syllables, meaningless words he invented himself, and then tested how well he retained them at different points. He was basically a human lab rat for his own experiments. What he discovered changed psychology forever. When people learn a list of items and then try to recall them later, they don't forget randomly, they forget strategically. Items at the beginning of a list are recalled with surprising accuracy. Items at the end of a list are recalled even better, especially right after learning. But the items in the middle, consistently, stubbornly, almost brutally forgotten. This became known as the serial position effect, and it breaks down into 2 separate but related phenomena: the primacy effect and the recency effect. Think of your memory like a stage. The performers who come out first get seen clearly before the crowd fills in. The performers who come out last leave when everything is still fresh and the lights are bright. But the performers in the middle, the ones who come out when the room is packed, everyone's talking, and people are already thinking about the parking lot, they're performing to a distracted house. Now let's look at what's actually happening in the brain. Segment 2. The primacy effect. Why beginnings stick. The primacy effect is why the first items in a list, the first impression in a meeting, the opening line of a book, the first thing someone says in an argument, carry disproportionate weight in your memory. Here's the neuroscience behind it. When you encounter new information, it enters a temporary holding area called working memory, basically your brain's RAM. Working memory is limited. It can hold roughly 4 to 7 chunks of information at once, according to research by cognitive psychologist George Miller. But here's the key. Information that enters working memory first, before it's crowded out by everything coming after, has time to be rehearsed. Your brain runs it over and over, almost like a loop. And the more something is rehearsed in working memory, the more likely it is to be transferred into long-term memory, the deep storage, the stuff that actually sticks. So the first items on a list get rehearsal time. The later items push them out before they have had a chance to consolidate. But by then, those early items are already encoded. They've been handed off to long-term memory like files that have already been saved. This is why first impressions are so devastatingly sticky. You meet someone at a party, and they say something slightly odd in the first 30 seconds. Something awkward, maybe a little too eager. And months later, that's still how you think of them, even if every conversation after that was perfectly pleasant. The first data point got rehearsed. The rest competed for space. It's why the opening of a presentation matters more than almost anything else. It's why interviewers remember the first candidate most clearly, a phenomenon documented in research by Neil Schmidt at Michigan State University on hiring panels. And it's why, if you're trying to teach someone something important, the very first thing you say shapes everything they retain. Segment 3. The recency effect. Why endings? Dominate the recency effect is almost the mirror image of primacy. But the mechanism is different, and so is the fragility. Items at the end of a list are remembered well, but for a different reason. They're still in working memory. They haven't been displaced yet. They're the most recent tenants of your brain's temporary storage, and when you're asked to recall something, they come flooding back because they were just there. But here's the catch, and this is critical. Recency memory is incredibly fragile. It depends entirely on whether anything else comes in between. Psychologist Baddeley and colleagues demonstrated that if you fill the gap between learning and recall, even just by asking someone to do a simple counting task for 30 seconds, the recency advantage almost completely disappears. The recent items get knocked out of working memory by the new information, and suddenly they're just as forgotten as the middle. This is why the last thing someone says in an argument can feel so definitive in the moment. But when you revisit the conversation the next day, after you've slept, eaten, talked to other people, it's somehow lost its power. The recency advantage faded. It's also why you might remember a lecture's final summary better than anything in the middle, but only if you go back and review it later. Otherwise, by the time you sit down to study, that just heard it advantage has already evaporated. And here's something that hits a little harder. It's why goodbyes matter so much. The last thing you said to someone, the last trip, the last dinner. We encode endings with disproportionate emotional weight, not just because of significance, but because of recency. The ending is what's still lit up in your brain's working memory as you walk away. Segment 4, the forgotten middle. What your brain is actually doing. So if the beginning gets saved to long-term memory and the ending is fresh in working memory, what happens to the middle? The middle is where cognitive load peaks. By the time you're 3 or 4 items deep into a list, a lecture, or a conversation, your working memory is full. New items are pushing out old ones before they can be rehearsed and transferred. You're in a constant state of displacement. New information arriving before the old information has been encoded. Neuroscientists call this proactive interference. Earlier memories making it harder to form new ones, and retroactive interference. Newer memories overwriting the ones that just came before them. The middle of any sequence gets hit by both. It's squeezed from both directions. Think about a long road trip you took. You probably remember the excitement of leaving, loading the car that first hour on the highway. You remember arriving, the relief, the first meal, the unfamiliar bed. But Tuesday afternoon, somewhere in the middle of the drive, the stretch of I-70 through Kansas, the gas station where you ate a bad sandwich, mostly gone. This isn't tragic, it's efficient. Your brain is making ruthless editorial decisions about what deserves neural real estate. Beginning signal novelty, something new is starting, pay attention. Ending signal closure. This chapter is done, make a note. The middle is the maintenance phase, the operational grind, and your brain, which runs on glucose and evolutionary efficiency, deprioritizes it. But here's where this gets complicated. Because the middle of things, the middle of relationships, the middle of careers, the middle of life, is where most of the living actually happens. Segment 5, how this affects your relationships. Think about a long-term relationship, romantic, platonic, professional. What do you remember most clearly? The beginning, meeting them, the newness, the excitement or the awkwardness, the way they said your name for the first time, and the most recent things. Whatever happened last week, last month, the last fight, the last time you laughed together, but the middle. The years of Tuesday evenings and ordinary dinners and mundane arguments about whose turn it was to do the dishes, that's mostly compressed into a feeling rather than a memory, a texture, a sense of, it was mostly good, or it was mostly hard, without the specific scenes to back it up. This has profound implications for how we evaluate relationships. Research in behavioral economics by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, specifically his work on the peak end rule, found that people judge experiences not by the average of how they felt throughout, but by 2 data points: the most intense moment, the peak, and the final moment, the end. The middle barely registers in our evaluation. This means a relationship that was genuinely wonderful for 12 years but ended bitterly can be remembered as worse overall than one that was mediocre for 3 years but ended warmly. The ending, the recency effect, recalibrates everything. It also means the middle of a relationship, the stable, comfortable, less dramatic stretch, is actively undervalued in memory. When couples reflect on when things were good, they often skip right over the longest, most ordinary chapter, not because it wasn't good, but because it didn't have primacy or recency on its side. If you're in a long-term relationship or any long-term commitment, this might be worth sitting with. The middle is probably better than you remember. The ordinary Tuesday evenings are probably more meaningful than they feel in the moment. They just don't get saved the same way. Segment 6, how this affects learning and work. Now let's bring this into the classroom and the workplace because the serial position effect has enormous practical implications for how we learn and how we teach. In a typical hour-long lecture, retention follows a predictable curve. Students are most alert and most retentive in the first 10 to 15 minutes. Primacy. They come back online in the last 10 minutes. Recency. But the middle 35 minutes? Research by neuroscientist John Medina, author of Brain Rules, found that attention and retention dip significantly in the middle of a long, uninterrupted presentation. This is why effective educators don't just talk for an hour straight. They create what learning scientists call spaced retrieval. Built-in pauses, questions, small breaks that essentially reset the primacy/recency clock. Every time you create a natural break, you create a new beginning and a new ending, giving more material a chance to benefit from those effects. Segment 7, strategies to protect the middle. So knowing all of this, what do you actually do with it? Write down the middle. If you're in a lecture, meeting, or important conversation, don't trust the middle to stick. The act of writing, physically encoding the information, does some of the rehearsal work your brain would otherwise skip. Notes aren't a crutch. They're a serial position bypass. Restructure your lists with the most important items at the edges. If you need someone to remember 5 things, don't bury the most critical item in position 3. Put it first, or last, or both. Mention it at the start and circle back to it at the end. Create deliberate breaks in long learning sessions. Every 20 to 30 minutes, pause. Ask a question. Do something different. Each break is a reset. It generates a new beginning and a new ending, giving more of your learning the serial position advantage. Review the middle intentionally. If you want to remember a book, a trip, or a conversation, go back to the middle. Write about it. Tell someone about it. The middle won't volunteer itself to memory. You have to go get it. Practice what psychologists call savoring the ordinary. Positive psychology researcher Sonia Lyubomirsky has found that people who deliberately pay attention to everyday moments, ordinary Tuesdays, unremarkable meals, quiet evenings, report higher life satisfaction over time. This is in part because they're actively counteracting the serial position effect. They're encoding the middle on purpose. Segment 8, the deeper meaning. Here's what I keep coming back to after going deep on this research. The serial position effect isn't just about lists and lectures. It's about the shape of memory itself. It's about how we construct the story of who we are, where we've been, and what our life has meant. We remember beginnings because they signal change, a new chapter opening. We remember endings because they signal consequence. Something closing, something decided. But the middle, the long, unadorned stretch of days between the beginning and the end, that's where we actually lived. The childhood wasn't just the first Christmas you remember and the last summer before you grew up. The relationship wasn't just the falling in love and the final conversation. The career wasn't just the first job offer and the retirement party. The middle is the life. And yet, by the architecture of human memory, it is precisely what we are most likely to lose. I think there's something both humbling and liberating about that. Humbling because our sense of our own history is profoundly unreliable, shaped more by peaks, ends, and beginnings than by the long, honest truth of ordinary time. Liberating because it means the middle. The unglamorous, unremarkable, unmemorable middle at star is probably richer than you're giving it credit for. You are living through the middle of something right now. Your brain will not remember this well, which means you might want to pay attention. So the next time you can't remember what was in the middle of a list or the middle of a story someone told you, or the middle of a decade. Don't be too hard on yourself. Your brain isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was built to do. But knowing that gives you something, a reason to be more intentional, to write things down, to pause and notice, to go back for the middle when it matters. Because the beginning and the end will take care of themselves. It's the middle that needs you.